The mop made a soft swishing sound against the marble floor as Lynn moved it back and forth in steady strokes. She'd been cleaning this same hallway for so many years now that her hands knew exactly how much pressure to apply, exactly when to rinse the mop head, exactly which corners collected the most dust. 15 years. That's how long she'd worked at the Riverside Concert Hall, and in all that time, she'd become almost invisible to the people who passed through these elegant corridors. It was nearly 10 o'clock at night, and the last of the evening's concert attendees had finally left. Lynn could still smell the expensive perfumes hanging in the air, mixed with the faint scent of champagne from the lobby reception. She didn't mind working late. In fact, she preferred it. When everyone was gone, the concert hall became hers in a way. She could work at her own pace, hum quietly to herself, and most importantly, she could spend a few precious moments in the main performance hall. Lynn wheeled her cleaning cart through the double doors and into the vast auditorium. The space always took her breath away, no matter how many times she entered it. Row upon row of red velvet seats stretched out before her, all facing the magnificent stage. And there, under a single spotlight that the night crew always left on, sat the grand piano. A Steinway, black and glossy, its surface reflecting the light like still water. She began her routine, moving through the aisles with her dustpan and brush, collecting programs that had fallen under seats, wiping down armrests, checking for any spills or stains, but her eyes kept drifting back to that piano. They always did. Lynn was 58 years old now, though people often told her she looked younger. Her black hair, pulled back in a simple bun, showed only a few threads of silver. Her face had lines, yes, but they were the soft kind that came from years of smiling politely, of keeping her head down, of not making waves. She wore the same thing every day: simple black pants, a gray shirt, and comfortable shoes that didn't make noise on the floors. She was the kind of person people looked right through, and she'd learned long ago that this was safer than being seen. But there was a time when she hadn't been invisible. There was a time when people had watched her with wonder instead of indifference. That was back in China, in a small village outside of Hangzhou, where Lynn had grown up in a house that always smelled like jasmine tea and old wood. Her grandmother had lived with them, a woman with silver hair and hands that seemed to hold magic. Those hands had once played in concert halls across China, back before the Cultural Revolution changed everything. By the time Lynn was born, her grandmother's performing days were long over, but the music hadn't left her. It lived in her fingers, in her voice, in the way she heard the world. Lynn's grandmother had an old upright piano, a battered thing that had somehow survived the chaotic years. Its keys were yellowed and some of the strings buzzed, but to 5-year-old Lynn, it was the most beautiful object in the world. She would sit beside her grandmother on the narrow bench, watching those weathered fingers dance across the keys, creating sounds that made her chest feel tight and her eyes sting with tears she didn't understand. "Music is not in the piano," her grandmother would say in Mandarin, tapping Lynn's small chest with one finger. "Music is in here. The piano is just how we let it out." Lynn had been a quick learner. Faster than quick, really. By the time she was 7, she could play pieces that students twice her age struggled with. Her grandmother would smile and nod, adding harder and harder compositions to her practice. Routine: Chopin, Liszt, Rachmaninoff. Names Lynn learned to pronounce before she fully understood who these composers were. The other children in the village thought she was strange, spending all her time indoors with an old woman and an older piano. But Lynn didn't care. When she played, everything else disappeared. The cramped house, the whispers about her family, the way her father would come home tired from the factory with his shoulders bent under invisible weight. When her fingers touched those keys, she went somewhere else entirely. At 12, Lynn won a regional competition. She still remembered that day with perfect clarity. The auditorium in the city, much smaller than the one she cleaned now, but impossibly grand to her child's eyes. The way her grandmother had braided her hair and dressed her in their best clothes. The feeling of sitting at a real concert grand piano for the first time. Its keys responding to her touch like they'd been waiting for her specifically. She'd played Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, and when she finished, the silence before the applause had stretched so long, she thought she'd made some terrible mistake. But then the room had erupted, and the judges were standing, and her grandmother was crying in the front row. They told her she had a gift. They said she could study at the conservatory in Shanghai. They talked about competitions, about opportunities, about a future that glittered like the chandelier above their heads. Lynn pushed her cleaning cart toward the stage now, her footsteps echoing in the empty hall. She climbed the stairs to the stage itself, something she only did after everyone had gone. The piano loomed before her, and she reached out carefully with her dust cloth, wiping away fingerprints from its glossy surface. She moved around it slowly, cleaning every inch with a care that went beyond duty. She never touched the keys, not once in 15 years. That would be crossing a line she'd drawn for herself long ago. Her father had gotten sick when she was 14. Cancer, the doctor said, and the treatment would cost more money than their family had ever seen. Her mother worked double shifts at the textile factory. Her younger brother was still in school, and the conservatory with all its glittering promises required money they didn't have. Lynn had made the choice herself. She'd walked away from the piano, away from her grandmother's dreams, away from the music that lived in her chest. At 16, she went to work in a shoe factory, her quick fingers that had once flown across piano keys now gluing soles and stitching leather. The money she earned went to her father's medicine, to her brother's school fees, to keeping their family afloat. Her grandmother had cried. "You'll come back to it," she'd said, gripping Lynn's hands. "The music doesn't leave. It just waits," but Lynn never did go back. Her father recovered, but by then, the moment had passed. Her brother grew up and got a good job. Lynn married briefly, divorced quietly, and when she was 32, she'd moved to America with nothing but 2 suitcases and an address for a distant cousin in the city. The jobs she could get were limited. Her English was rough, her credentials meaningless here, so she cleaned. Office buildings at first, then homes, then finally this concert hall. And every night after everyone left, she allowed herself these few minutes with the piano, close enough to remember, far enough to keep from breaking. Lynn finished dusting and stepped back, looking at her reflection in the piano's polished surface. An older woman in plain clothes looked back at her, holding a dirty rag. Nothing special, nothing remarkable, just another person the world had learned not to see. She turned away and went back to her cart, gathering her supplies to finish cleaning the rest of the hall. Tomorrow night she would do the same thing. And the night after that. This was her life now, and she'd made peace with it, or so she told herself, as she did every night, ignoring the way her fingers sometimes moved in her pockets, practicing pieces only she could hear. The night started differently than usual. Lynn arrived at her normal time, 7 o'clock, but instead of the quiet, empty building she expected, the concert hall buzzed with activity. Catering staff rushed through the corridors carrying trays of champagne glasses. Someone had brought in enormous flower arrangements that filled the lobby with the scent of lilies and roses. Men in tuxedos and women in gowns were beginning to arrive, their laughter echoing off the marble walls. "What's happening tonight?" Lynn asked Chen, the security guard who usually nodded to her when she arrived. "Private fundraiser," he said, checking names off a list. "Some rich donors having a party in the performance hall. They rented the whole place out. You'll need to stay out of the way until they're done." Lynn nodded and wheeled her cart toward the back hallways. She knew the drill. On nights like this, she'd clean the offices and practice rooms first, then wait until the event wound down before tackling the main spaces. It meant working later than usual, but she didn't mind. The overtime pay was good, and it wasn't like she had anywhere else to be. She worked slowly through the administrative wing, dusting desks and emptying trash bins, trying to ignore the sounds of the party filtering through the walls. Music played from the hall, though not live music. Just a playlist through the sound system. She could hear the bass thumping, people talking and laughing over it. Around 9:30, she was finishing up the practice rooms when she heard footsteps in the hallway. She stepped back, making herself small against the wall as a group of people passed. They were clearly guests from the fundraiser, dressed in clothes that probably cost more than Lynn made in 3 months. They didn't even glance at her. By 10 o'clock, Lynn figured enough time had passed. She carefully pushed her cart toward the performance hall, planning to at least start cleaning the lobby area. The double doors to the main auditorium were propped open, and she could see the party was still in full swing. Maybe 50 or 60 people scattered throughout the SPE. They were hearing. The damper mechanism, she thought. It has to be the dampers. When a piano's dampers failed, the felt pieces that stopped the strings from vibrating no longer made proper contact. Notes would sustain indefinitely, bleeding into each other, creating a muddy mess of sound. "Listen to this thing," the man at the piano shouted to his friends. "This piece of junk is broken. And this place charges how much to rent it? He banged on the keys again, harder this time. Lynn flinched. Each impact felt like it was landing on her own body. Thomas, leave it alone, one of the women said, though she was laughing. You're going to break it more, Thomas. So that was his name. Lynn studied him from her position in the doorway. He was maybe 45, with the kind of polished appearance that came from expensive haircuts and tailored clothes. His face was flushed from drinking, and he had the loud, careless manner of someone who'd never been told no in his life. Break it more? It's already trash, Thomas said, playing a sloppy scale that sounded like chaos with all the notes ringing together. He spun around dramatically, surveying the room. We should get some entertainment out of this disaster. Who wants to play? His companions shook their heads, still laughing. None of us can play piano, Thomas. Then we'll find someone who can. His eyes, bright with alcohol and mischief, scanned the room. They landed on Lynn, standing just inside the doorway with her cleaning cart. Lynn's stomach dropped. She tried to step back, but it was too late. Perfect, Thomas announced loudly, pointing at her. You there? The cleaning lady. Come here. Lynn shook her head slightly, staying where she was. I'm working. I should not interrupt. Oh, come on. We're bored, and this piano's broken anyway. Can you play? No, Lynn lied, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't play. But Thomas was already walking toward her, and his friends were watching now, sensing entertainment. Everyone can play a little something. Chopsticks or Mary Had a Little Lamb, right? Come on, give it a try. Just for fun. I really can't, Lynn said, her English getting worse as her anxiety rose. I need to work. It'll just take a minute, Thomas insisted, and now he was close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. Unless you think you're too good to entertain us? The way he said it made some of his friends laugh uncomfortably. Lynn felt heat rise to her face. She understood the trap. If she refused again, she'd look arrogant, uppity. Like the cleaning lady thought she was above these wealthy people, and if she complained, she could lose her job. The concert hall couldn't afford to offend donors like these. Just one song, another man called out. Come on, it'll be funny. Funny, they wanted it to be funny. They wanted to watch her struggle with the broken piano, to giggle at the cleaning lady's clumsy attempt at playing. Lynn had seen this kind of cruelty before, dressed up as friendly fun, the way wealthy people sometimes entertained themselves with the people they considered beneath them. Thomas was gesturing toward the stage now, making a big show of it. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a volunteer. Come on, let's give her some encouragement. A few people started clapping in a mocking way. More guests were drifting over now, sensing something happening. Someone pulled out their phone. Lynn's hands were shaking. She wanted to run, to grab her cart and disappear into the back hallways. But there were too many people watching now. Too many eyes on her, and Thomas was standing right there, blocking her path, his expression cheerful but his eyes hard. Go on, he said, his voice quieter now, meant just for her, unless you want me to mention to management how uncooperative you've been. There it was. The real threat under the friendly suggestion. Lynn's grandmother had once told her that some people were like storms. You couldn't fight them directly. You could only bend like bamboo and wait for them to pass. So Lynn set down the rag she'd been holding, wiped her damp palms on her pants, and walked slowly toward the stage. The room was watching her now. She could feel dozens of pairs of eyes tracking her movement. Someone whistled. Someone else laughed. Thomas followed behind her, narrating her walk like a sports announcer. Here she goes, folks. Let's see what we've got. Lynn climbed the stairs to the stage, her legs feeling disconnected from her body. The piano sat there under the lights, its lid open, the keys visible. She hadn't touched piano keys in 30 years. 30 years. And now she was supposed to play for these people's entertainment on a broken instrument, while they laughed at her. She reached the piano bench and stood beside it, not sitting yet. Her hands hung at her sides. She looked out at the audience. More people had gathered now. Phones were definitely out recording. Thomas stood off to the side with his arms crossed, grinning like he'd just told the world's best joke. Any time now, he called out. Or can't you actually play at all? More laughter. Lynn slowly sat down on the bench. The height was wrong for her, but she didn't adjust it. Her hands moved to her lap, fingers twisting together. The keys were right there in front of her. 88 keys. The same as every piano she'd ever played. The same as her grandmother's old upright. The same as the concert grand where she'd played Beethoven at age 12. She placed her hands on her thighs just above the knees, the position her grandmother had taught her to start from. Back straight. Shoulders relaxed, breathe. The room was still making noise, people talking and laughing, but it was getting quieter. Maybe they were actually curious about what would happen, or maybe they were just waiting for the embarrassing part. Lynn lifted her hands slowly and let them hover over the keys. Her fingers remembered this position, curved slightly, wrists level, ready. 30 years since she'd last done this. 30 years of silence. 30 years of walking past pianos and not touching them, of hearing music and not playing it, of being invisible while the music lived only in her head. But here, right now, under these lights with these people watching and this broken piano waiting, something shifted inside Lynn's chest. Something that had been locked away for 3 decades began to crack open. She took one more breath, and then she placed her fingers on the keys. The first note came out soft, just a single key, pressed gently with her right index finger. The sound floated out into the hall, clear and pure despite the broken dampers. It hung in the air longer than it should have, sustaining, ringing. Lynn didn't fight it. She let the note sing. Then another note joined it. And another. Her left hand came to life, finding its position on the lower keys. The muscle memory was still there, buried under 3 decades of silence, but returning now like breathing. She was playing Chopin. Ballade number 1 in G minor. She hadn't planned it, hadn't thought about what piece to choose. Her fingers had simply found their way to the opening notes, and now there was no turning back. In the audience, someone's laughter cut off mid-sound. The piece started quietly, almost like a question being asked. The melody moved between her hands, simple at first, gentle. Lynn kept her eyes on the keys, watching her fingers find positions they hadn't held since she was a teenager. This was one of the pieces her grandmother had taught her, one of the last ones before everything changed. It was also one of the hardest pieces in the classical repertoire, though the beginning didn't reveal that yet. The broken dampers on certain keys meant those notes would sustain, bleeding into the next sounds. Lynn's ears caught which keys were affected within the first few measures. Without thinking, without planning, she began adjusting. She avoided some notes entirely, replacing them with alternatives that kept the melody intact. Where she couldn't avoid the broken keys, she leaned into them, letting the sustained notes become drones, turning the piano's flaw into something almost intentional. Another phone came out in the audience. Then another. The piece began to build. Chopin had written this ballade like a story, starting soft and mysterious, then growing in intensity. Lynn's fingers moved faster now, finding the running passages that connected the themes. Her right hand climbed up the keyboard in a series of quick notes while her left hand provided the foundation. The muscle memory was fully awake now, and her hands seemed to know what to do without her conscious mind directing them. She'd practiced this piece hundreds of times as a girl, in her grandmother's house on that old upright piano with its buzzing strings and yellowed keys. She'd played it until her fingers ached, until she could perform it in her sleep, until her grandmother nodded with satisfaction and said, "Now you understand it." The hall had gone completely quiet. Even Thomas had stopped smiling. Lynn let herself sink deeper into the music. The notes poured out faster now, more complex. Her hands crossed and recrossed, her fingers flying across the keys in patterns that looked impossible to anyone who didn't play. This was the section where Chopin tested the performer, where the technical difficulty ramped up suddenly, where many pianists stumbled or tensed up. But Lynn didn't stumble. Her shoulders stayed relaxed, her wrists fluid. This was what her grandmother had taught her. The piano responds to tension with tension, she'd said. Stay soft, stay flowing, and the music will come. The broken notes kept ringing, but Lynn had learned the pattern now. She used them like a painter uses a limited palette, working within the constraints, making the flaw part of the art. When a note sustained too long, she built chords around it. When multiple notes bled together, she shaped the melody to use the resonance then fight it. In the third row, a woman lowered her phone, her mouth slightly open. The piece moved into its second theme, a more lyrical section. Lynn's right hand sang out the melody while her left provided gentle support. This was the part that had always made her grandmother cry. "You feel it, don't you?" she'd asked young Lynn. "You feel what Chopin is saying?" Lynn had never been sure what the piece was saying exactly, but she felt it. In her chest, in her throat, in the way her breath caught. The music was about loss, maybe. or longing, or the space between what you wanted and what you had. It was about beauty that hurt to hear because it reminded you of everything you'd given up. Her fingers pressed harder into the keys now, drawing more volume from the instrument. The piece was building towards something. The audience could feel it too. She could sense their attention sharpening, people leaning forward in their seats. The technical passages came faster, runs that covered 3 octaves in the span of a second, chord progressions that required her fingers to stretch to uncomfortable intervals, rhythms that felt like they were falling apart, but were actually precisely controlled chaos. This was where the piece earned its reputation as one of the hardest in the repertoire. Lynn's hands never hesitated. They remembered every note, every rhythm, every dynamic shift. The knowledge had stayed in her fingers all these years, waiting. She barely thought about what came next. Her body simply knew. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Her arms were starting to ache. She'd done nothing more physical than pushing a mop for 3 decades. And suddenly she was asking her muscles to perform feats that required the conditioning of an athlete. But she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The music had taken over completely. The piece climbed higher, louder, more urgent. Chopin built tension like a master storyteller, making you think you knew where the story was going, then shifting it at the last moment. Lynn's hands hammered out the fierce chords, the ones that sounded like thunder, like anger, like someone finally saying all the things they'd kept silent for too long. Someone in the audience gasped, and then came the descent. The moment where the piece finally broke open and poured out everything it had been holding back. Lynn's right hand ran down the keyboard in a cascade of notes, each one perfectly placed, perfectly timed, while her left hand crashed out the bass chords that grounded it all. She could feel tears on her face but didn't stop to wipe them away. Her hands kept moving. The piece wasn't done yet. The final section arrived. The part where Chopin brought back the opening theme but transformed it, showing how everything had changed. Lynn played it with her whole body now, swaying slightly with the rhythm, her shoulders rising and falling with the phrases. The broken piano sang beneath her fingers, its flaw somehow making the sound more raw, more real. The last series of chords approached, the ones that would end the piece. Lynn prepared herself, knowing what was coming. The finale was brutal, fast, loud, technically punishing. It required throwing your entire weight into the piano, trusting that the keys would respond, that your fingers would land in the right places even at that speed. She took the smallest breath and then she unleashed it. Her hands became blurs. The chords crashed out in rapid succession, each one perfectly voiced, perfectly timed. The broken notes rang and rang, creating a wall of sound that filled the entire hall. Left hand, right hand, both hands together, climbing higher and higher until they reached the final chord. Lynn struck it with everything she had left. Both hands came down together on the keys, pulling every ounce of sound from the instrument. The chord rang out, massive and complete, the broken dampers letting it sustain and sustain, filling the space with sound. And then she lifted her hands away. The chord kept ringing in the silence. The broken piano sang on, the notes slowly fading but taking their time about it as if they didn't want to let go. Lynn sat very still, her hands hovering above the keys, her breathing hard and fast. Sweat had soaked through her gray shirt. Her arms trembled with exhaustion. She kept her eyes on the piano, afraid to look up, afraid to see the audience. The silence stretched out. The chord faded, 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 and then someone started clapping. It was just one person at first, somewhere in the middle rows, but then another joined in, and another. Within seconds, the entire room was applauding, not the polite golf clap of social courtesy, real applause. The kind that comes from people who've just witnessed something they didn't expect and don't quite understand but know was extraordinary. Lynn finally looked up. Faces stared back at her. Dozens of them. Some of the women were crying. Several men had stood up. The phones were still out, still recording, but the people holding them looked stunned. Near the stage, Thomas stood frozen. His arms were no longer crossed. His face had gone pale. The smirk had disappeared entirely. Lynn's hands dropped to her lap. She didn't know what to do. Should she stand? Should she bow? Should she run? The applause got louder. Someone in the back shouted, "Bravo!" Others picked it up. "Bravo! Bravo!" A woman in an elegant black dress was making her way down the aisle toward the stage. She was older, maybe 60, with short gray hair and an air of authority. Lynn recognized her vaguely. She'd seen her around the concert hall before. Someone important. The woman climbed the stairs to the stage and approached Lynn, who instinctively started to stand to get out of the way, to become invisible again. But the woman reached out and took both of Lynn's hands in hers, stopping her from leaving. "Don't you dare move," the woman said softly but with steel underneath. "That was extraordinary. Who are you? What's your name?" Lynn's mouth opened but no sound came out at first. Her English abandoned her completely. Finally she managed, "Lynn, I clean here." "You clean here," the woman repeated, shaking her head slowly. "Where did you learn to play like that?" "Long time ago," Lynn whispered. "In China. My grandmother." The applause was still going, though people were quieting down now, trying to hear what was being said on stage. Lynn was aware of all those eyes on her, all those phones pointed at her. She wanted to disappear, wanted to go back to being invisible. This was too much attention, too many people seeing her. "How long has it been since you played?" the woman asked. Lynn had to think about it, had to count the years. 30, she said finally. Maybe more. 30 years I don't touch piano. The woman's grip on her hands tightened. 30 years, she repeated, her voice rising enough that others could hear. This woman hasn't touched a piano in 30 years, and she just played one of the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire. On a broken instrument, perfectly. More gasps from the audience. More phones coming up. Lynn sat in the small office backstage holding a paper cup of water someone had brought her. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. The woman in the black dress, who had introduced herself as Helen Rodriguez, the concert hall's artistic director, sat across from her, along with 3 or 4 other people whose names Lynn had already forgotten. Everyone was talking at once, asking questions, but their words blurred together into noise. "Please," Lynn said quietly, setting down the cup before she spilled it. "I should go back to work. I have to finish cleaning." "Forget the cleaning," Helen said firmly. "Lynn, what you just did out there was remarkable. I've been working in classical music for 35 years, and I've rarely heard anything like that. We need to understand your story." "There is no story," Lynn said, but even as she spoke, she could feel something cracking inside her chest, something that had been sealed tight for so long that she'd forgotten it was there. "I used to play, long time ago. Then I stopped. That's all?" "That's not all," Helen said gently. "Nobody plays Chopin like that by accident. Nobody works around a broken damper mechanism like you just did without years of training." "Where did you study?" Lynn's eyes filled with tears. She didn't want to tell this story. She'd buried it so deep that even thinking about it hurt. But Helen was looking at her with such kindness, and the other people in the room had gone quiet, waiting. So Lynn began to talk. She told them about her grandmother, about the old upright piano in their house in China, about learning to play when she was 5 years old, about practicing for hours every day until her fingers cramped, and her grandmother would make her stop and drink tea. She told them about the competitions, about the judges who said she had a gift, about the conservatory in Shanghai that wanted to accept her. And then she told them about her father getting sick, about the medical bills that swallowed everything, about making the choice at 16 to leave music behind and go work in the factory, about the years that followed one after another, each one taking her further from the piano, further from the girl she'd been. "When I come to America," Lynn said, her English breaking down as the emotions rose, "I think maybe I start again. Maybe I find piano. But I have no money, no time. I work 2-3 jobs, send money back to China for my brother's school, for my mother, and then too much time pass. I become too old. I think the music is gone, but it wasn't gone," Helen said softly. "It was waiting." Lynn shook her head, tears running down her face now. "I am 58 years old. I'm cleaning lady. This is my life. What happened tonight, it is a mistake. Should not happen." "A mistake?" One of the other people in the room spoke up. A younger man with glasses. "Lynn, do you understand what's happening right now? That performance is already online. People are sharing the video. You're going to be famous by morning." Lynn looked at him blankly. "Famous?" He held up his phone, showing her a screen she didn't understand. Numbers were going up. Comments were scrolling past faster than she could read. "This video has been viewed 50,000 times in the last 20 minutes, he said, "and it's accelerating. Everyone wants to know who you are." The room started spinning. Lynn gripped the edge of her chair. "No," she whispered. "No, please. I don't want this. I just want to work. I just want to be left alone. I understand this is overwhelming, Helen said, reaching across to touch Lynn's arm. But you have a gift. A rare, beautiful gift. And tonight the world got to see it. You can't put that back in the box. I have to, Lynn said desperately. You don't understand. I have bills. I need this job. If people know about this, if I become, she didn't know the word in English. If I become big news, I lose everything. My quiet life. My privacy. I don't want. A knock on the door interrupted her. Helen called out permission to enter, and the door opened to reveal Thomas, the man who had forced her onto that stage. He stood in the doorway looking uncomfortable, his face still pale, his earlier swagger completely gone. I'm sorry to interrupt, he said quietly. I was hoping I could speak to Lynn for a moment. Lynn felt her whole body go rigid. She didn't want to talk to this man, didn't want to look at him. He had humiliated her, used her as entertainment for his friends, and now he was here in this room where she was trying to hold herself together. I don't think that's a good idea right now, Helen said coolly. Please, Thomas said. I need to apologize. You can apologize from there, Helen replied. She clearly didn't like this man, and she wasn't trying to hide it. Thomas stayed in the doorway, his hands shoved in his pockets. He looked at Lynn, and for the first time that night his eyes seemed clear, sober. What I did tonight was wrong, he said. Completely wrong. I was drunk and stupid and cruel, and I'm sorry. I thought I was being funny. I thought it would be entertaining to watch someone struggle. I didn't know. I couldn't have known that I could play. Lynn finished for him, her voice harder than she'd ever heard it. You think that make it okay? If I couldn't play, if I go up there and sound bad like you want, that would be better? Thomas flinched. No, God, no. That would have been worse. That would have been me being even more of a monster than I already was. I'm saying I'm sorry. For all of it. For treating you like you were less than human. For using you as a joke. He trailed off, shaking his head. There's no excuse. I'm sorry. The room was silent. Lynn looked at this man who had terrified her just an hour ago, who had backed her into a corner and forced her onto that stage. She should hate him. Part of her did hate him. But another part, the part that had spent 30 years learning how to survive by being invisible, by not making waves, by letting storms pass over her, that part just felt tired. You should go, she said quietly. Thomas nodded. He looked like he wanted to say more, but Helen was already standing, moving toward the door, making it clear he needed to leave. He backed out into the hallway, and Helen shut the door firmly behind him. I'm sorry you had to deal with that, Helen said, returning to her seat. That man is a donor, but after tonight I don't care. We don't need his money that badly. Is okay, Lynn said, though it wasn't okay. Nothing about tonight was okay. Her whole world had been turned upside down, and she didn't know how to turn it back. Helen pulled her chair closer. Lynn, I want to offer you something. A position here at the concert hall. Not as a cleaner, though you can keep that job if you want it, but as a consultant. We have practice rooms that sit empty most days. You could use them. You could play again. Lynn stared at her. I don't understand. Consultant for what? For our education programs. For working with students. For helping us understand what real talent looks like. Helen leaned forward. You have something precious, Lynn. Not just skill, though your skill is extraordinary. You have authenticity. You have truth in your playing. That's what everyone heard tonight. That's what made people cry. I can't teach, Lynn said, shaking her head. My English not good enough. I don't have certificates. I don't know how. Your English is fine. And you don't need certificates to share what you know. You just need to be willing to try. Helen paused, studying Lynn's face. I know this is scary. I know you've built a life around being invisible, around staying safe. But Lynn, what if you didn't have to be invisible anymore? What if you could be seen? The words hit Lynn like a physical blow. 30 years of invisibility. 30 years of keeping her head down. Of being the person people looked through. Of protecting herself by taking up no space at all. And this woman was asking her to step into the light. I don't know if I can, Lynn whispered. You just did, Helen said gently. Out there on that stage with all those people watching, with that broken piano, you stepped into the light and you were magnificent. Lynn closed her eyes. She could still feel the piano keys under her fingers, still hear the notes ringing in the air. For 30 years she told herself the music was gone, but it hadn't been gone. It had been waiting, just like her grandmother said it would be, waiting for her to come back to it. But coming back meant risking everything. It meant being visible. It meant people would want to know her story, would ask questions, would expect things from her. She'd spent 3 decades learning how to want nothing, how to need nothing, how to be content with the small, quiet life she'd built. Could she really give that up? I need time, she said, finally opening her eyes. I need to think. Of course, Helen said. Take all the time you need, but Lynn, the world is going to be interested in you now, whether you want it or not. That video is out there. By tomorrow morning, you're going to have news outlets calling, people looking for you. You can't make yourself invisible again. That ship has sailed. Lynn felt panic rising in her chest. What do I do? You decide who you want to be, Helen said simply. The woman who hides from what happened tonight, or the woman who walks toward it? Lynn didn't sleep that night. She went home to her small apartment, the same place she'd lived for 15 years, and sat by the window watching the city lights. Her phone, an old model that barely worked for calls, kept buzzing with messages from numbers she didn't recognize. She turned it off. By morning, just as Helen had predicted, everything had changed. The video had gone viral. Not just popular, but truly viral. The kind of internet phenomenon that crosses borders and languages. Cleaning lady's hidden talent stuns room, read one headline. Woman plays perfect Chopin after 30 years, read another. The video had been viewed millions of times. Millions. People were sharing it, commenting on it, crying over it, arguing about it. Lynn's phone wouldn't stop buzzing even after she turned it back on and immediately off again. She unplugged her landline. She was afraid to leave her apartment, afraid that somehow people would recognize her on the street. Though that seemed impossible. She was nobody. Just a cleaning lady in a big city, but the messages kept coming. They found her email somehow. They sent letters to the concert hall. News stations wanted interviews. Musicians wanted to meet her. Someone created a fundraising page without asking her permission, trying to raise money so she could pursue her dreams. Lynn felt like she was drowning. 3 days after the concert, Helen showed up at her apartment. Lynn almost didn't answer the door, but Helen called through it. Lynn, please. I know you're scared. I just want to talk. Lynn opened the door. Helen stood there with a bag of groceries and a gentle smile. I thought you might not be eating, she said. Can I come in? They sat at Lynn's small kitchen table, the same table where she'd eaten quiet meals alone for 15 years. Helen didn't push her to talk. She just made tea the way Lynn's grandmother used to and waited. I can't do this, Lynn said finally. It's too much. Too many people. Too much noise. I know, Helen said. But Lynn, something beautiful is happening too. Do you know what people are saying about your performance? They're not just impressed by the technical skill. They're moved by the story, by the idea that music doesn't leave us even when we think we've left it behind. They don't know my story, Lynn said bitterly. They don't know what it cost to give up music. They don't know about factory work and sending money home and being invisible for 30 years. They just see video and think his beautiful story. But my story is not beautiful, is sad, is full of losing things. Then tell them that, Helen said quietly. Tell them the real story, not the fairy tale version everyone wants. The true version. The hard version. Lynn shook her head. Why? Why I should tell anyone anything? Why I can't just go back to my life? Because you can't, Helen said gently. That life is gone now, Lynn. I'm sorry, but it is. The question isn't whether you can go back. The question is where you go from here. Over the next week, Lynn slowly began to emerge from her apartment. Helen helped her navigate the overwhelming attention, screening calls, declining the media requests that felt exploitative or sensational. But there were some things that couldn't be declined. A famous pianist named David Wong, who had been born in China before moving to America as a child, posted a video response to Lynn's performance. He talked about the immigrant experience, about the sacrifices people made, about the dreams that got put aside so families could survive. He said Lynn's performance reminded him of his own mother, who had been a dancer before giving it up to work in a restaurant so he could have music lessons. The video brought Lynn to tears. Someone understood, not just the music, but the cost of it. Then a music foundation reached out, not with demands or expectations, but with a simple offer. They wanted to pay off Lynn's debts. All of them. The money she still sent to her family, in China, The credit cards she'd been paying down for years, the medical bills from a surgery 2 years ago. Everything. In exchange, they asked for nothing except that she consider continuing to play. Lynn stared at the letter for an hour, unable to believe it was real, unable to believe that strangers would do this for her. Why? She asked Helen on the phone. Why they care about me? Because you reminded people that extraordinary things can exist in ordinary places, Helen said. You reminded them to pay attention, to see people they might otherwise look right through. Slowly, carefully, Lynn began to say yes to small things. She agreed to one interview with a journalist who promised to be respectful, who wanted to hear the real story. The article that resulted was honest about the hard parts, the sacrifices, the years of loss, but it was also hopeful about what came next. She accepted Helen's offer to use the practice rooms at the concert hall. The first time she walked into one and closed the door, facing a piano without anyone watching, she broke down crying. But then she sat down and played, just for herself. No audience, no cameras, just Lynn and the piano and the music that had waited 3 decades to come back. Her fingers were stiff at first, out of practice. But slowly, day by day, they remembered more. She started with simple pieces, the ones her grandmother had taught her first. Then gradually she worked back up to the harder compositions. Her hands ached, her shoulders cramped, but she kept going. People at the concert hall began to notice her differently. The other cleaners, her co-workers, looked at her with new respect but also some distance. She wasn't quite one of them anymore, but she wasn't quite anything else either. She existed in a strange in-between space. One evening, about a month after the viral video, a young girl approached Lynn in the hallway. She was maybe 10 years old, with her mother standing nervously behind her. "Excuse me," the girl said in accented English. "Are you the piano lady? From the video?" Lynn nodded, unsure what to say. "I play piano too," the girl said. "But my family, we don't have a lot of money. My mom says maybe I should stop lessons. But I don't want to stop, I love playing." Her eyes filled with tears. "Did you really not play for 30 years? Lynn knelt down so she was eye level with the child. "Yes," she said softly. 30 years. I think music is gone. But music doesn't leave. It waits." "What if I have to stop?" the girl whispered. "What if I can't play anymore?" Lynn thought about how to answer this, about all the years she'd lost, all the music that had lived only in her head, about the pain of walking past pianos and not touching them, but also about this moment right now where she was playing again, where the music had come back. "If you have to stop," Lynn said carefully, "you stop. You do what you need to do for your family, for your life. But you remember, you keep the music here." She touched the girl's chest the way her grandmother had once touched hers. "And maybe one day when time is right you come back to it. Music waits, always waits." The girl hugged her, sudden and fierce. Her mother was crying. Lynn felt something shift in her chest. Maybe this was why the story had spread so far. Not because of the technical skill or the dramatic setup, but because it spoke to something people needed to hear. That it's never too late. That what you give up doesn't disappear forever. That you can find your way back. 2 months after the viral video, the concert hall announced a special performance. Nothing big or fancy, just a small recital in one of their intimate venues, and the performer would be Lynn. She almost said no. The thought of performing again, of being on a stage with people watching, terrified her. But Helen had been patient and persistent. "You don't have to prove anything," she'd said. "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be yourself. Play for the people who showed up because they care about your story. Play for the little girl in the hallway who needed to hear that music waits." The night of the recital, Lynn stood backstage in borrowed concert clothes that didn't quite fit. She could hear people taking their seats. The venue held maybe 200 people, and Helen said it had sold out in 20 minutes. People wanted to hear her play again, wanted to be part of her story. Lynn thought about running, about calling it off, about going back to cleaning and invisibility and safety. But then she thought about her grandmother, who had believed in her so fiercely, about the factory years, and the sacrifices and all the music that had lived in silence, about the broken piano and the forced moment that had cracked her open, about the young girl who needed to know that giving something up didn't mean losing it forever. She walked onto the stage. The audience was different than the one at the fundraiser. These people had come specifically to hear her. They weren't wealthy donors at a party. They were students and teachers and immigrants and working people, people who saw themselves in her story, people who had given things up and wondered if they could ever get them back. Lynn sat at the piano, a real concert grand, properly maintained, no broken dampers. Her hands found their position on the keys. She played Chopin again, the same ballade, but this time it was different. This time she wasn't playing through humiliation or shock. She was playing because she chose to, because the music was hers, had always been hers, and she was reclaiming it. The piece poured out of her, and this time she let herself feel everything, the loss and the longing and the anger at all those lost years, but also the gratitude, the second chance, the way the music had waited for her just like her grandmother promised it would. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. But more than that, it was warm, real. People stood not because they were supposed to, but because they meant it. After the recital, Lynn stood in the lobby meeting people. They thanked her. They told her their own stories of things they'd given up and hoped to return to. A man who had been a dancer, a woman who had painted, a teenager who wrote poetry but was being pushed toward engineering. And the young girl from the hallway was there with her mother. The mother approached Lynn shyly. "A foundation contacted us," she said. "They want to sponsor my daughter's lessons. They said someone suggested her. Was it you?" Lynn had made a phone call, had remembered the mother's name from that evening, had asked Helen to connect her with the music foundation that had helped her. She hadn't told anyone. "Music should not stop for money," Lynn said simply. "If she loves it, she should play." The mother's eyes filled with tears. Thank you for everything, for the inspiration, for the help, for showing us it's possible." Lynn watched the little girl, already miming piano, playing with her hands, and felt something settle in her chest. Maybe this was what the last 30 years had been building toward. Not just her own return to music, but the ability to help others find their way back too. 6 months later, Lynn had a new life. She still cleaned, but only part-time. The rest of her time was split between practicing, performing small recitals, and teaching. She taught young students, but also adults. People who had given up music years ago and wanted to try again. People who thought it was too late. She told them all the same thing her grandmother had told her. Music doesn't leave. It just waits. And sometimes, late at night when the concert hall was empty and everyone had gone home, Lynn would sit at the piano in the practice room and play. Not for audiences, not for videos, just for herself and for her grandmother and for that 16-year-old girl in China who had walked away from music because she had to. "I came back," she would whisper to the empty room, to the memory of her grandmother, to the girl she used to be. "Just like you said I would. The music waited. And now I'm home."